In this course, we ask you to spend a lot of time on discussion boards and we give you quite a lot of feedback. And because we've tried to make this course self-exemplifying, I thought it was really important to explain why we're doing that and what we're actually doing, how we're actually going about giving that feedback, what the theories and principles are behind it. So I'm going to do a short video now about giving feedback on discussion boards, which hopefully will explain why we're working with you in the way that we are, but also, really importantly, hopefully will explain how you could take this technique and use it in other places. So, as we say, we use a lot of discussion boards, we set you tasks, we get you talking. They're a core part and requirement of this course. And discussion boards are good because they're asynchronous. They happen at different times and they fit in well with learners' lives. So they don't require you to be online all the time as it would if we were doing the learning on Zoom. But they also offer you a space for writing and reflection, for consolidation of the knowledge acquisition that you've been doing, so a place to think over what is it that you've actually learned. They support the development of analysis, so we'll normally ask you to do some writing about something you've seen or read. And in that, we're asking you, yes, to tell us what you've learned, but also to take it a stage further and think about what it means. And they're importantly a social learning space. And I'm going to say a bit more about this in a second. And also, they're a way to manage formative and potentially summative assessment. So discussion boards are very flexible, a very powerful tool. So in fact, discussion boards are the perfect social learning tool, really, because they get you interacting with each other. So yes, we ask you to put stuff out there, to say things, but also to read what others have, and others have a lot to offer you, and to comment on that. And so that helps to build your analysis. You see different perspectives. You learn from how others have seen things. And it's worth just reminding ourselves of this distinction between formative and summative forms of assessment. So when we're talking about formative assessment, we're talking about assessment for learning. It's good for monitoring students' understanding and progress. It's a provision of feedback. It usually happens during the course. But of course, we also do summative assessment in many courses, where we think about the assessment and description of learning. We describe what's been learned. Often we use a grade to do that. And that usually comes at the end of the course. And even though it's a summative assessment, it should still contribute to learning, I think. Now, it's possible to use discussion boards in both of these ways, but I think we tend to use them more commonly for formative learning. It's also worth saying something about the importance of motivation, because this is one of the places where discussion boards go wrong quite commonly. Discussion boards really have to be a course requirement, even if they don't lead to a grade. Because if you make them optional, if you say, well, if you've got a question or if you want to think about this more, put it on the discussion board, then you tend to find that it's actually quite rarely used. But if you make them a course requirement, then students have to use them, they have to engage with them, and they usually get a lot out of this. So it doesn't have to become a summative requirement. This is, of course, an instructional design decision that you might make. You might want to make it a summative requirement. But in fact, often we decide to make it formative, but still to be a criteria for completion. So when we're designing a discussion board or when we're designing a discussion activity that we want people to do, we're going to use this etivity model that broadly we draw from Gilly Salmon. So at the heart of it is a spark. We give people something to read, something to do, something to listen to that gets them thinking. And then we give them an activity. So write something, do something, or whatever. And then we require interaction. And finally, we will give them some feedback. So a discussion board is not just a question of putting a question out there, it's thinking this through. There's a set of design decisions we're going to make as we put this together. So an example might be watch the lecture and write a paragraph or two on how the theory applies to your life. So we've given them a spark, that's a lecture, and then we ask them to do something, write something about how it applies to their life, giving them some help here, does it make sense, is it easy to apply? And then we're designing some interactivity. So reply to someone else's post and say whether you agree or disagree with them and why. So that's the kind of format that we'll normally take. If it goes well, you see that somebody first very tentatively post something, and then someone else replies or posts their own thing. And if it goes really well, you see that you get lots and lots of messages starting to appear as people comment, and then organically people will normally start to talk to each other and share ideas. So how do you manage this when you start to get all of this interaction, all of these posts, all of this wonderful content from students? How do you manage that as a teacher or a tutor? Well, if you're not careful, you will really quickly be overwhelmed. There's just so much to do. So you've got to think about how to manage it quite strategically. And one of the things that you shouldn't do is kind of run into the group straight away and start feeding back to everybody as you go along. You can very easily dominate the group, and then that will lead students to have an unwillingness to contribute. So then what we're trying to do is let the students talk, let them think, let them put ideas out there. And at the end of the task, we then come in and we say, okay, that's been great. Let me provide you with a summary. And so the summary might include reading the posts. It will include you naming the people who've contributed, especially those who've made really good and interesting contributions, because we really want to reward them and encourage them and signal the people who are doing interesting stuff. We want to summarize the main points that people have made. It's very possible that some of the students haven't read everything, so we want to draw out what the key parts of this discussion that they should be aware of in their learning. And we want to highlight interesting points, and where students do things like share links and resources, that's always really useful. We want to do that as well. And we want to make links to the wider program content and to the next task. So we might finish this by saying we'll be looking at that in more detail next week, and that kind of thing. We're not always introducing lots of new content at this point of summary because we don't want to overwhelm people. So that's one of the things to remember. This is not primarily about introducing new content. So if we think back to those formative learning tasks, we're assessing to encourage learning, we're monitoring students' understanding and progress, we're providing feedback, and it's taking place during the course so they can go on and learn more and reapply it later on. Well, this might feel a bit daunting as a teacher. How long is it going to take is probably what you're thinking. Well, actually, as you get used to it, you can get it pretty organized. So it depends on the task. Obviously, if it's a complex task where students have written a lot, then it might take a bit longer. But I always think it should take about an hour. You maybe won't read every single post that every student has read. You might sample some if you've got a very big group or if they're writing a lot. But ideally, what you're doing is pulling out the main ideas, getting the main points that people are making, and presenting it back to them in a summary form. So usually perhaps 3 to 5 paragraphs might be typical. And ideally, you're mentioning about half of the participants each week, and trying to make sure that you mention the people who are doing really good work, but also anyone who you think might need a bit of extra encouragement. And it shouldn't require additional reading or research. So you're not going out and finding out new stuff. You've done the teaching, you've provided them with the content, you're asking them to discuss it, and then you're summarizing what they've discussed. Of course, you might add an occasional bit of additional information in, but that is not the primary purpose of what we're doing here. So in summary, I think discussion boards are a huge asset for e-learning, for integrated guidance. They require careful instructional design to get the most out of them. Tutors should let the group interact and not dominate that group. And summarizing the discussion really comes at the end. And this should be done in a structured way, which is useful for the students and manageable for the tutor. So thank you for that. Hopefully some of that was of interest. It will hopefully give people a good idea of what we're trying to do in the course, but also give you a technique that you might use elsewhere. Thank you.